Sumner picked the rifle up off the bench like it was something he'd found dead on a roadside. He turned it over once, sneered at the warm bluing and the long, old-fashioned barrel, and let it drop back onto the steel firing bench from a good 8 inches up. The clatter went down the whole line, and a couple of younger competitors actually flinched. "We're loaning out antiques now," he said, loud the way a man says a thing when he wants 40 other men to hear it. "This is the Sentinel Cup, sweetheart, not show and tell at the VFW." Nobody laughed exactly. But nobody told him to shut his mouth either, and on a firing line full of operators that silence is its own kind of verdict. Captain Marlowe Bishop didn't reach for the rifle right away. She looked at it lying there on the cold steel, her father's Winchester. The pre-64 Model 70 in 30-06 that had gone uphill 881 with a 19-year-old Marine and come back down again, that had sat in a fleece-lined case in a closet in Idaho for 30 years before it ever sat in her hands. And then she looked up at Sumner and she smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It was the small, patient kind, the kind that doesn't reach for anything, because it already has everything it needs, and it did something to Sumner's face that he covered fast, but not fast enough. Some part of him, the animal part that had kept him alive in places he'd never put on a resume, registered that he had just made a mistake and didn't yet understand what it was. If you're watching this, do me a favor. Subscribe to Untold Truth Stories and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. Because the woman in this story spent 20 years being the only one in the room, and she'd want to know how far the room got. The Sentinel Cup was held every spring out at the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center in 29 Palms, in the part of the Mojave that doesn't forgive anything. It is an invitational, which means you do not enter it. You are selected for it by a board that reads your record and decides whether you are worth the cost of feeding you for a week. And the men who got the call were the kind of men whose names did not appear on public lists. Navy snipers, Army Rangers, and a couple of quieter Army men whose unit was identified on the roster only by a hyphen. Force Recon Marines. The board had selected 41 of them that year, and it had selected Marlowe Bishop, and the difference was that the other 40 had arrived expecting to compete, and she had arrived having already decided what was true. She'd grown up in the Owyhee country of southern Idaho, where the canyons run deep, and the wind comes off the high desert with nothing to slow it down, and an honest meanness to it that she had come to respect the way you respect anything that will kill you if you stop paying attention. Her father, Royce Bishop, had taught her to shoot there on cold mornings before school, standing behind her in the sagebrush with his hand light on her shoulder, teaching her the thing he believed was the only thing worth teaching, that the rifle was not the instrument. She was the instrument. The rifle was a tool she happened to be holding, and a tool can break, and the wind doesn't care about your tool. And the day you learn to read the wind without a meter is the day you stop being a person who shoots and start being a shooter. He had taught her arithmetic the same way he taught her windage, which is to say, as if the two were the same subject, because to him they were. By the time she was 12, she could compute a holdover in her head faster than the older boys could dial it, and she did it the way other children recite the names of states. By the time she was a captain in the United States Marine Corps, with 3 deployments behind her and a Palma title, nobody at this match had bothered to look up. The arithmetic had stopped feeling like arithmetic at all. It had become a sense, the way a carpenter's hands know plumb without a level. She looked at a target and a distance and a band of mirage boiling off the desert floor, and the number simply arrived. That was the thing the men on the line did not yet understand about her, and it was the thing that was going to undo every assumption they'd carried onto that range. The match director was a Marine colonel named Frank Ostrander, 53 years old, lean as a fence post, with the flat affect of a man who had spent his whole career being lied to by people who wanted things from him and had developed an allergy to performance. He stood in front of the assembled competitors that first morning in a low cinder block building that smelled like burnt coffee and gun oil, and he did not look at Bishop any differently than he looked at anyone else, which she noticed, because almost nobody managed it. "You're here because somebody decided you were the best this country currently has," Ostrander said. "Whether that's still true is the only question this week is going to answer." He let that sit. "One thing before we start. This is a marksmanship match. It is not a gear match. The services run plenty of gear matches, and you are welcome to go win one of those. If your rifle has to tell you what to do, you are going to have a long, bad week out here, and I will not be sorry about it." He did not look at anyone when he said it. He didn't have to. In the front row, Sumner raised his hand with the easy confidence of a man who didn't have a question so much as a desire to be seen, having one. Colonel, equipment sheet says standard optics are authorized but unrestricted. I'm seeing at least one shooter running open sights. Is there a waiver if some of us want to simplify our setups? Or, and here he let the smallest pause do the work, is that more of a sentimental thing? The men around him heard the smile in it. Ostrander looked at Sumner for a length of time that began to get uncomfortable around the third second. Iron sights are legal, he said. They were legal at Camp Perry before your grandfather was born, and they'll be legal after you're gone. There's no waiver because there's nothing to waive. He picked up his clipboard. Next. Sumner sat back, satisfied because he had succeeded at the only thing he'd actually been trying to do, which was to make sure every man in the room had Bishop's rifle on his mind before the first shot was fired. He did not look at her. That was deliberate. Contempt that refuses even to acknowledge its target is a particular discipline, and Sumner had practiced it. She looked straight ahead and let him have it. Her father had taught her that too. You don't spend ammunition before the match. The first relay was a known distance string, the dull foundational work that sorts the real from the merely confident 20 shots, 200 to 600 yards, 2 minutes a target, scored on ring value. With good glass and calm air, an elite shooter ought to clean it or come close. The wind that morning was a left-to-right quartering thing. 8, guesting 11, and you could see it walking the mirage in long, lazy ribbons if you knew how to look. And Bishop knew how to look. She drew lane 11. Sumner drew lane 10, which put her in the edge of his vision for the whole string, and she never found out whether the range officer had done that on purpose or whether the universe just has a sense of humor. She went prone and settled the old Winchester into her shoulder and brought her pulse down the way her father had taught her. 3 long breaths until it sat somewhere most people her age needed medication to reach. Through the aperture sight, the 200-yard target was a small black circle framed in a ring of brass, and the front post sat in the dead center of it, and she breathed out and let the natural pause come at the bottom of the breath and broke the shot inside it. She did not look to check. You either did it right or you didn't, and looking back wouldn't change the hole already in the paper. She cycled the bolt, that lovely old Mauser pattern action her father had kept slicker than anything coming out of a factory now, and moved to the second target. On her left, she could hear Sumner's turrets, the precise, expensive click of a man dialing a solution his ballistic computer had handed him. His first shot came 3 seconds after hers. She heard the scorer call it 9. Good, not perfect. Her third was called a 10 center. Somebody up on the observation deck made a small sound. The shot that changed the temperature of the whole morning was her 12th, 400 yards. Where with open sights there is no forgiveness left in your fundamentals at all, where that front post covers a chunk of the target. The width of a nickel and the wind is a thing you feel rather than a thing you measure. She felt it, she waited. The gust eased for exactly the second she needed, and she put the shot through that second. 10, center. Up on the deck, a voice said something sharp and then stopped. On lane 10, Sumner had quit firing. She knew it the way you know a sound has stopped. Not because she was watching him, but because the rhythm of his reports had been part of the air, and now it wasn't. He had noticed. She didn't look. Shot 15,500. Shot 1750 more. By the time she reached 600, the wind had built to a sustained 12, with a crosswind that shifted a hair every 40 seconds in a pattern she'd been quietly cataloging since she lay down, and she rode it with the front post alone, holding off the target's edge by amounts she never put into words, and the bolt cycled and the shot went and the scorer called it. 10, center. The range master, a master gunnery sergeant named Cal Delahunt, who everyone on every range in the Marine Corps simply called Top, had been running lines for 20 years and had the settled face of a man convinced he'd already seen the whole catalog of human ability. He said nothing for a full 3 seconds after that last call. Then he said, to no one, quietly, well, I'll be damned. The scorer walked the line collecting cards, and when he reached Bishop's lane, he held hers a beat longer than the others. Clean, he said, not announcing it, just reading it aloud with the small wonder of a man who'd been told a thing wasn't supposed to happen and had now watched it happen. He moved on. Bishop became aware that the observation deck had gone very quiet. She looked up. Old habit, you always know it's above you. and found Colonel Ostrander at the rail looking down at her, not smiling, not frowning, looking at her the way a man looks at something he needs a minute to take apart and understand. Then he raised his binoculars and turned back to the range, and that was all, and it was enough. What happened at lunch told its own story without anybody saying a word. Bishop carried her tray to a table near the window, and a margin of empty space opened around her, the way space opens around a thing people haven't decided how to file. Not exile. Recalibration. A heavy-set Army Master Sergeant named Theo Banco sat down across from her after a minute with the unbothered ease of a man too old to care about the politics of a mess hall. Banco, he said. Army. He didn't offer the unit. Saw your name on the roster and couldn't place it for 2 days. Then it came to me. You won Palma at Raton, what, 3 years back? Iron sights, 1,000 yards. You beat a field of men who outjeered you 10-1. He nodded slowly, like he was confirming something to himself. Figured somebody ought to come over here and act like you're a person. Bishop, she said. Marines, and I appreciate it. He looked over at the center table, where Sumner was holding corded volume, and she could pick up fragments across the room. Beginner's luck, and waitle the movers, and 600 in dead air doesn't mean anything. Bancole ate for a while and then said, without lowering his voice much, he's going to be a problem. He was already a problem, she said. He just didn't have a reason yet. And now he does. Now he thinks he does. She set her fork down. There's a difference that matters. A man who's a problem for no reason is just weather. You wait it out. A man who decides he's got a reason starts making moves. And that's when you finally get to see who he actually is. Bancole considered that. Your daddy teach you that one? My daddy taught me everything worth knowing, she said. The rest I learned being the only woman in a lot of rooms full of men who'd already decided how the week was going to go. She looked out at the heat coming off the parking lot. Somebody went through my gear last night. His fork stopped. Nothing taken. Nothing broken. Moved. The careful kind of moved, where it's supposed to look like nobody touched it. I packed my kit in a sequence, and the sequence was wrong this morning. You sure? I'm sure. You report it. To who? She said, and there was no bitterness in it, just the flat arithmetic of a woman who'd long ago worked out the answer to her own question. Bancole was quiet a moment. Then he said he'd keep his eyes open, and she said she knew he would. That's why she'd told him. And across the mess, Sumner said something that made his table laugh, and she didn't look over, and she finished her food at exactly the pace she'd intended to finish it. Because the morning you let another man's eyes change your pace is the morning you've handed him something you can't easily take back. The first real act of sabotage she found that night. She'd gone to the equipment cage at 2140 to pull her match ammunition for the next day. Hand loads she'd built herself. Every case weighed, every charge thrown twice, the kind of obsessive consistency that is the difference between a tight group and a respectable one at distance. The ammo cans were where she'd left them. But the lot tags were wrong. Someone had pulled her tag match rounds and reseated, in the same boxes, factory loads of a different lot entirely. Rounds that would chamber and fire and look identical and group 3 or 4 inches off her 0 at 600, which is the difference between a 10 and a 4, which is the difference over a string, between winning the Sentinel Cup and being quietly sent home as a woman who couldn't hold up under pressure. It was a smart move. It was a coward's move, but it was smart. Because it would have looked like her. It would have looked like the wheels coming off, like the early scores had been nerves and luck, like the men who'd assumed all along had been right all along. She stood there in the cage under the buzzing fluorescent light, and she did the thing her father had taught her to do with anger, which was not to swallow it and not to spend it, but to convert it. Anger, he used to say, is just unrefined fuel. It'll burn your engine up raw. You run it through something first. She ran it through something. She reweighed every round she had left by hand, sorted the real from the substitutes by the faint difference in their primer crimp that the saboteur hadn't known to match, and she rebuilt enough true match ammunition to finish the week. Then she put it all back exactly as she'd found it and went to bed and was asleep in 4 minutes because she'd decided that letting him cost her sleep would be a second theft, and one was enough. The movers came the next afternoon. The time scenario, 12 targets appearing in random sequence at mixed distance, 8 seconds of visibility apiece, acquire in red and break or it's scored a miss. It is a discipline that punishes hesitation and pays the one thing that separates a real marksman from a merely proficient one, which is the nerve to trust your first read and never argue with it. Bishop did not argue with a single read. She let the aperture frame each silhouette as it rose, let the number arrive the way it always arrived, and broke the shots inside the 8 seconds with 2 to spare, and somewhere around the 8th target the observation deck stopped pretending it wasn't watching only her. Colonel Ostrander stood at the rail beside a man who had not been there the day before. An older man, silver at the temples, with the particular stillness of high rank. A lieutenant general's stars on a flight jacket, he wore the way men wear things they've earned and stopped noticing. His name was Hollis Caraway, and he had flown in unannounced because a phone call from Ostrander had said only, "You need to come see this." And Caraway had spent enough years around the edge of human performance to know that Ostrander didn't make calls like that. "Open sights," Caraway said, watching the 11th silhouette fold. It wasn't a question. "Open sights," Ostrander said. "Where's she from?" "Idaho. Father was a Marine." Caraway was quiet a moment. Down on the range, Bishop fired again, and the line made the sound a line makes when elite men watch a thing they cannot do, being done by someone they hadn't wanted there. That low involuntary exhale, almost ashamed of itself. "What was his name?" Caraway said. "The father." "Bishop. Royce Bishop." Royce Bishop, Kaysan, 68. The general's expression changed by a degree. The way a man's face moves when he hears a name arrive out of a context he wasn't braced for. He didn't say anything else for a while. He just watched, and after a moment he reached up and adjusted his binoculars, though they had not needed adjusting. The board posted that evening had Bishop first, and not by a hair. Sumner was 5th. He stood in front of it for 15 seconds without moving a muscle, and then he turned and walked out, and the door did not slam, which was worse. He closed it with the deliberate control of a man saving the violence for something he'd already chosen. Bankel came up beside her at the board. "5th place is eating him alive," he said quietly. "I know. You don't seem worried about it." "Worry stays off the range," she said. "And off the range it turns into preparation." She looked at him. "He swapped my ammunition last night. He made a phone call yesterday he shouldn't have had the access to make. And he just shut that door like he was afraid of what his own hands might do. That's not a man who's done. That's a man who's finally serious." She turned back to her name at the top of the board. "I'm not afraid of him. I just need to know which way he's going to move before he moves. And if you don't figure it in time..." She looked at the column of numbers, her name above all of them, and somewhere under that the memory of frost on Idaho sagebrush and a hand light on her shoulder and a dead man's voice saying the same patient things over and over until they become the shape of who she was. "Then I handle whatever comes," she said, same as always. The storm came on the morning of the 4th day, and it did not come the way rain comes. It came the way the desert comes, which is to say, as the desert itself lifted and thrown. She heard it before the light changed. A long, low freight train sound off the eastern hardpan, building too fast to be wind and arriving as a wall. A haboob, the meteorologists called it. The kind of dust storm that rolls off the Mojave 1,000 feet high and turns noon into a brown dusk, that fills every inch of space between you and the next thing until distance stops being a measurement and becomes a theory. By the time the competitors filed into the briefing room, the targets at 200 yards were rumors, and the targets past 400 were nothing at all. Just a churning ochre, nothing, and the building's lights were on at 9 in the morning. Top Delahunt stood at the front, looking like a man who'd been up since the first gust. Dry uniform, red-rimmed eyes, the focus of someone who'd spent the night reading conditions instead of sleeping. "Storms forecast to hold through 1800, he said. "Sustained 35 to 45, gusts measured to 61. Visibility you can see for yourselves." He let it land. "Day 4 proceeds. The long stage gets cut from 1,200 yards to a minimum of 8 on account of the visibility. Anybody who can't run a rifle in this is encouraged to withdraw now rather than mid-string. Withdraw now, it goes on the books as a weather withdrawal. Withdraw during a live stage, it goes on the books as a performance failure." He paused. Questions. The room was doing math, and the math was brutal, and every man in it knew it. High-end glass fogs when temperature and humidity swing fast, and they were swinging fast. Laser rangefinders need a surface to bounce off and a clear path to bounce through, and the air had neither. Electronic wind meters read the wind at the muzzle, which in a storm like this told you nothing about the wind 200 yards downrange where it had already changed its mind twice. Thermal overlays drowned in particulate. Batteries died in the cold the storm had dragged down behind it. Every advantage these men had paid 5 figures for had just become, in the span of one morning, a liability, because a confident wrong number will kill you faster than an honest blank. Bishop had iron sights. Iron sights have exactly one weakness, which is that you have to be able to see the target. And in this, past 300 yards, seeing was going to require something no optic could supply and no battery could power. It was going to require knowing the wind without measuring it, knowing the drop without dialing it, knowing the shot before the rifle confirmed it. She had spent 20 years learning to shoot when she couldn't see, because that was the only time you ever found out whether you actually knew the thing or whether you'd only been reading the instruments. The best time to learn the wind, her father used to say. On the worst mornings in the OE, when the snow came in sideways and he made her shoot anyway, is when you can't see a damn thing. That's the day it'll tell you the truth about yourself. By the time the long stage opened, there was an empty chair in the room and everyone pretended not to see it. A Navy man from the East Coast had withdrawn 40 minutes earlier. Primary optic shorted in the dust. Backup fogged past, saving, and Bishop thought his withdrawal was the single most honest act anyone had committed all week. They shot it one at a time because that was the only safe way to run a line you couldn't see across. Each shooter at the 800-yard line, one spotter, a target somewhere out there in the brown that you took on faith. Sumner went before her. She heard the whole thing without watching it, the way she heard everything. He'd swapped to a backup scope, a rugged, fixed-power thing, and even that was failing him, fogging at the ocular, and she heard it in his shooting, the long hesitations, the dialing and redialing, the shots coming late and ragged. He hit some. He missed more. When he stood up, his jaw was a clenched white line, and he did not look at the board, and he did not look at her. Then it was her turn, and the thing the men had been waiting 4 days to see her fail had finally arrived. She lay down in the blowing dust, and she pulled the old Winchester in tight, and she did not look for the target, because there was no target to look for. There was the storm. So she did what her father had taught her to do with a thing too big to see, which was to read everything around the thing instead. She read the dust streaming off the berm at her 2 o'clock and clocked its angle. She read the way the flags she couldn't see were straining at their lines by the pitch of the rope whom the wind dragged out of them. She read the temperature on her own skin and the density of the air in her own lungs, and she felt the 800 yards out there not as a distance but as a weight, the way she'd felt every distance since she was 7 years old. The number arrived. She didn't doubt it. Doubt was a thing for men who'd never learned to shoot blind. She held off the place where she knew the target was, not where she could see it, where she knew it was, and she let the natural pause come, and she broke the shot. The spotter, an old chief who'd seen everything, watched the splash through a scope that showed him almost nothing, and then keyed up, and his voice came out strange, like it had surprised him on the way up his throat. "Hit," he said. "Center." She cycled the bolt. She did it again. And again. 8 shots into a target she never once saw, in a wind no machine on that range could measure, and the spotter called them as they landed in a voice that got quieter each time, the way a man's voice gets quiet in church. "Hit, hit, hit." On the observation deck, Carraway lowered his useless binoculars and just stood there in the blowing grit with his hands at his sides. Ostrander said nothing at all. Down on the line, when she stood and cleared the chamber and set the rifle safe, the dust was already settling onto her shoulders and her hair, and she looked like what she was, which was a person the desert had failed to stop. They found what Sumner had done that night because he'd gotten desperate enough to get sloppy. The ammunition swap traced back to his access card, logged at the cage at an hour he had no reason to be there. The phone call traced to a favor he'd tried to call in to have her palm a title quietly questioned, to plant the idea she'd cheated her way to it. Top Delahunt walked the logs to Ostrander himself. An Ostrander who had spent a career being lied to and had built his whole self around hating it did not raise his voice once. Sumner was confined to quarters and removed from the standings before the final day. There was no scene. There rarely is when it's real. He just stopped being on the board, the way a man stops being on a board, and the space where his name had been filled in with the name below it, and the range went on. Bishop won the Sentinel Cup on the 5th day in clearing air. But by then, nobody was really keeping the kind of score that mattered to her, because something else had taken the room over, and she didn't understand what it was until the ceremony that evening. They held it in the base's formal assembly room, and by the time the doors opened, every chair was filled, and men stood 3 deep along the walls because word had moved the way word moves on a military post. Not through the official channels, but through the human ones, person to person. The story growing as it went until everyone had heard a version and come to see the end of it for themselves. Bishop stood at the front in dress blues with her father's rifle in her hands. She'd insisted on holding it. Someone had started to say something about ceremony protocol and then stopped himself, because some arguments answer themselves before you finish making them. Ostrander spoke without notes. 4 days ago, he said, I stood on a deck I couldn't see 10 feet off of and listened to a spotter call hits on a target nobody on the space could find, fired by a Marine using sights my grandfather would have recognized. He paused. I've done this 30 years. I've trained with the best shooters this country has built. And I watched something this week I'd told myself I'd never see, which was a person be better than her equipment in a moment when everybody else's equipment was all they had. The room said nothing. But this week wasn't about shooting, he said. Shooting is just what we do. This week was about what makes the shooting, the thing underneath it that holds when the gear fails and the weather turns and the men around you have already decided you don't belong. That thing isn't issued. It's handed down. He looked at her. It's taught by somebody on cold mornings long before you ever needed it. He turned and General Caraway stepped forward holding a small case, the kind used for medals, and the room understood before a word was said that night had just changed shape. 5 days ago, Caraway said, the colonel told me the name of this officer's father, and I want to tell you that I knew that name before he finished saying it, and I want to tell you why. He opened the case. What was inside caught the light and several men near the front leaned in without meaning to. The Navy Cross, Gunnery Sergeant Royce Bishop, Caraway said. And the name landed in that room with 30 years of silence behind it, was a 19-year-old scout sniper on Hill 81 South in the spring of 1968. On the worst night of that siege, with his position about to be overrun and the corpsmen pinned and the wounded stacking up, he held a sector alone with a bolt-action rifle and iron sights through the dark, and he kept it held until the line could reform and a medevac could get in. The citation that was written for him says his marksmanship directly enabled the evacuation of 19 wounded Marines. Caraway's jaw worked once. He was recommended for this decoration in 1968. The recommendation was lost in the administrative collapse of that summer and never completed. That failure belongs to us. It belongs to the institution. It does not, and never did, belong to him. He looked at her, and his voice came down to something almost private, though the whole room heard it. Tonight, on the authority vested in me, I am initiating the posthumous award of the Navy Cross to Gunnery Sergeant Royce Bishop, to be received by his next of kin. A breath. Captain Bishop, if you'd come forward. She stepped forward. Her eyes were dry and her hands were steady, and she held her father's rifle in her left hand, the way he'd taught her to hold everything, straight, present, committed to the moment, without apologizing for being in it. Caraway lifted the cross from the case. He held it a second before he gave it to her, not for the ceremony of it, but because he was a man who understood exactly what was in his hand and wanted that understanding to be something the room could see. Then he placed it in her right palm, and she looked down at it, at the medal and at her father's name on the citation beside it. Royce Bishop, Gunnery Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, the name she had known her entire life. Attached at last to the thing he had earned 30 years before she was born and never once been given. And she felt him in the room, not as grief inventing him, not as fantasy, just as the residue a person leaves in the things they've touched and taught and loved. He was in the rifle in her left hand. He was in the cross in her right. He was in every shot she'd fired into that storm, and in every freezing Idaho morning that had built the hands that fired them. and in the patient voice that had said over and over, until it became the architecture of her, that the rifle is only the tool. You are the instrument. She looked up at the room. 40 competitors from every branch, the range staff and the base. Bankholt near the back with his arms folded and his face doing serious work to stay still and not entirely managing it. And at the very front, where she had not expected him, Brett Sumner was standing. Confined to quarters had not meant barred from the room, and someone had let him come, and he had chosen to. He stood straight with his hands at his sides, and his face had the look of a man who has arrived somewhere difficult and is trying, for once, to be honest about it. Their eyes met. She held his a moment. Then she gave him a single small nod, not forgiveness. That was a longer conversation, and a more private one, and not anything like approval, just an acknowledgement that he was there, that being there had cost him something, and that the cost meant something, even if it could never be enough to undo what he'd done. He nodded back and looked at the floor. Carraway raised his voice one last time. We have started to trust our machines more than ourselves, he said. We've started to believe that better tools make better warriors. Captain Bishop spent 5 days reminding us of the older truth, which is that the machine can change the war, but the warrior is still the thing that wins it. And the warrior, he said, looking at her, is made by people like the man whose rifle she carried into this room. The room came to its feet. Not on a signal, not all at once. Each man stood when he got there by his own road, in a wave that rolled from the front to the back, chair by chair, until the whole room was up, and the sound they made was not applause. It was lower and longer than that, the sound people make when they are honoring something they recognize as real. Marlowe Bishop stood at the front of it, with her father's Navy Cross in one hand and his rifle in the other, and she let the sound move through her without trying to hold it or perform any answer to it. She had spent her whole career never asking for a moment like this, doing the work because the work was right, because a man in Idaho had made her understand that the doing was its own reason whether or not anybody ever noticed. But recognition, when it finally comes 30 years late, partly hers and mostly his, turns out to be a thing you didn't know you'd been carrying the absence of until it set down. She felt his hand on her shoulder, light, the way it had been before school, with the frost on the grass and the rifle between them and all the lessons still ahead. She pressed the cross flat against her chest, and she understood, all the way down in the body, where the truest things live, that she had not come to the desert to prove she belonged, or to break anything, or to make a point to men who'd never been willing to see it. She had come to finish what her father started, and she had. The rifle was in her hands, the cross was over her heart, the room was on its feet, and Gunnery Sergeant Royce Bishop of Hill 881, of the Owehee Canyons, of every cold morning that had taught a girl to read a wind she could not see, was finally, irrevocably, and completely home.